Welcome to one more episode for Update Brazil. One more time here we have Luis Orleans Bragança and Jeff Knights again. Thank you very much, Felipe, to be with us here. And I'm very glad. The topic is very, very deep, and we have a lot of things to learn here. I can do that. I can say that for myself. I'm learning here with you both. And I hope that our audience will be very glad with this topic. Hi, Jeff. How's it going?
It's going good, thank you, Alan. It's we're on a Saturday today, so it's a little bit later in the morning for me, so I'm a little more awake.
Okay. Hi, Luis. How's it going?
Hi. How are you, Alan?
Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Luis. So I guess we're going to be talking about the role that bureaucracy and communism played together, and the development of socialism and I guess you could say the ossification of various countries and how it works. Maybe I will just begin with a comment about where I see bureaucracy being the biggest negative in cultural terms. And of course, there's economic effects as well. Bureaucracy, let's define bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, Ludwig von Mises said, was the rational organization of authority. Well, that was Weber said authority. He said it was a rational organization for carrying out tasks. And whereas you had earlier forms of human organization, like, well, there's the family, and you have patriarchal structures where the father is the head of the household, the oldest male inherits. You have these are what we saw in feudal structures, and we see it in the family, and it's quite ancient. And a king is sort of a father figure over a country, a larger family, a tribe, tribal leaders. But with bureaucracy, you have this ordered structure. It's supposed to be meritocracy. It's supposed to be organized, the best qualified people. You might have testing. You might have people brought in. But in practice, we find that, and I find this in the United States, that the education system, a giant bureaucracy, was taken over by the communists, penetrated. I mean, the New York and New Jersey school systems were taken over by communists in the 1930s. So that when we had investigations in 1940 in this country, they discovered that the school system was already in New Jersey and New York at the elementary level removing patriotic education from the schools, which had already been bureaucratized. And one problem with bureaucracy, you have a top-down organization, a pyramidal organization, where you can take over the top of the organization, and you don't have ownership like you do with an entrepreneur in a business or a family. It's like my child, my company, my employees. It's very impersonal form of organization. And so you can have people who really aren't, they're not really members of that society in their thinking. In their thinking, they could be very alien. They could be communists. And they could take over that bureaucracy, and they could subtly reshape it in a way that allows them to promote certain people and to promote an agenda and to change consciousness. So, Luis, maybe you could comment on this.
Yeah, I'm glad that we're touching on this subject because Brazil is going through this situation where, the political environment and the forces that constrain bureaucracy are no longer there. So, bureaucracy will have a tendency to take over everything where there is a political space. Usually you have all these agents. They're supposed to limit the amount of bureaucracy or to use it in a fashion that is at least makes some financial sense from the taxpayer point of view. But once you lose that metric, the bureaucracy is more powerful than the political agents that were elected to limit it, and civil society is not really engaged on this. Bureaucracy is more of a éminence grise, as you call it in France. You really can't see it, but you feel it. You know the effects of it even more than the government itself, elected government itself. So when civil society has a hard time to counterattack the effects of bureaucracy, and I believe that if you do not create the systems within civil society to uprise against bureaucracy, I think I was reading the critique of Weber and Mises, and both of them were very worried about, you know, the extent to which bureaucracy would grow and would take over every single space, and the conditions in which that would take place. Of course, if you have a socialist or communist government that has that as their motto, it's easy, right? You know, they depend on bureaucracy. They foster bureaucracy. It's their tool. So the effects of bureaucracy are a little bit accelerated. If you don't have a socialist government, is already difficult. Even in that situation, it's difficult for you to limit the extent to which bureaucracy will eventually take over, unless you have a very active civil society with the mechanisms that allow civil society to combat and to fight against the growth of that bureaucracy. And we're seeing that in Brazil more so than ever, because probably it's because I think we're getting into that limit of intolerance where, you know, the amount of regulation and taxes are already reaching a critical point where, you know, it's one of those inflection points where everybody agrees that, you know, it's enough, and maybe we're getting to that stage. So and then we realize that we're powerless. We don't have the mechanisms in our constitution to fight against the growth of democracy, whereas more advanced states, Europeans and Americans, they have mechanisms. I'm talking about, you know, the power to revoke some of the bureaucratic decisions or some of the elected officials' decisions. If we don't have that power given to us in our constitution, within, you know, I don't know, the next 3 to 5 years, for sure we're going to be taken over by our bureaucracy. So that's one of the things that I'm very interested in talking about, even making this subject even more public, is because we're facing that situation right now. It's something practical, and the idea of it is what spurred the idea of, okay, we need to talk about it, at least in theory, or, you know, see other environments that are suffering from the same issues. So I think the Mises approach is very interesting, and I would actually reading a book. I spoke about this book in a earlier Hangouts, but I'm reading a book by Hans Adam. He's the reigning prince of Liechtenstein. Have you read this book, Jeff?
I haven't read it. No.
I would urge you to read it, because it talks about specifically about this subject of transforming governments into service providers, into businesses that are service providers. You know, he assumes that people and all the taxpayers are supposedly shareholders of government, and, you know, therefore they need to ask or demand from this government a service commensurable to the amount of taxes that they're paying. And the name of his book is The State in the Third Millennium, and I think it's, to be quite honest, it fits Brazil to it's far removed from what Brazil is today. We're a very totalitarian, socialistic country at this point in our history. But it's exactly how we need to look at the state if we need to reform it, into what we need to reform it. It's one where civil society has a direct impact on the amount of government and exactly how their taxes are going to be used. And you need to create those mechanisms via direct democracy, via the initiation or, you know, referendums for. It's basically what Professor Olavo de Carvalho mentioned, a plebiscitarian republic. You know, it basically creates a situation where you're referending. You have systems of making referendums, at least on a passive way, meaning you still have an official, an elected official, or even a bureaucrat. He passes on legislation, and the people have the power to revoke that decision some way or another, via referendum, or Parliament accepts that people, the suggestion that at least a good amount of people do not want that legislation going through. So I think that's the evolution of our state and our. I think it's a great set of ideas for Brazil. Obviously, the transition is going to be very interesting. How do we get that? How do we get there? But it's something that I see the effects of a growing, unlimited bureaucracy here in Brazil, due to the fact that we are no longer represented.
Mm-hmm.
Was this a case in the transition? I'm not sure how the the governments in the Eastern Europe or communist Russia, how their bureaucracy changed, or if it changed at all, once it became democratic, or at least more democratic than what it was before. Has the bureaucracy changed to that effect, or it only continued on growing and creating it has its own history, which is probably parallel to the political.
The bureaucracies in Eastern Europe have adjusted to democracy, and they maintain, in all the former communist countries, they maintain a kind of power of their own, which still looks, and I'm told by people in those countries, they still are looking over their shoulder to Moscow, because they maintain the same mentality. And they might make democratic noises, but they know on what side their bread is buttered. They'd like the old dispensation back. They'd feel more secure because they're challenged by the people and by democratic organization. But there's something I should mention as a catch-22 to any attempt to reforming modern bureaucracy. And I should say something that von Mises said, is that bureaucracy itself is merely a rational organization in order to make greater efficiency in whatever process you're putting forward. But there's the question of who runs the bureaucracy, who gives animation to it. And it would be perhaps if your bureaucracy had the right principles, if your bureaucratic leaders had the right principles, then it might not be such a danger. But if your leading bureaucrats turn out to have socialist or collectivist principles and are basically opposed to checks and balances, which is how I characterize the essence of the Western civil order, going back to the Romans and the ancient Greeks, checks and balances was something that is attributed to the founder of ancient Spartan constitution, that the Romans copied, that Polybius wrote about, that other ancient Greeks wrote about, Cicero wrote about it. We have our founding fathers in the United States. The main idea, of course, Lord Acton said it, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. With bureaucracy, you have the concentration of efficient power in an organization that is administratively organized according to a discipline where supposedly the person at the top gives an order and the orders are carried out, going down the program, whatever it is. There's no voting in a bureaucracy. And there's no feudal relationships where there's a semi-independence of the feudal baron that's beneath you, who he has certain choices now he can make. There's not an imposition of policy necessarily implied. And I should point out that the bureaucracy doesn't have the family relationships and the feeling relationships necessarily that the family has or that a tribe has or that are organic. There's something inorganic about bureaucracy. Now, the caveat, the catch-22, you probably heard of Robert Michel's, the man who wrote the book Political Parties more than 100 years ago. Michel's studied the organization of democratic or social democratic parties in Europe in the early 20th century to talk about democracy and rule by the people. And he found a problem. He found that to win elections, you have to bureaucratically organize, right, to win elections, which means you create a pyramidal top-down party structure to run elections, to win elections, and that this structure itself is anti-democratic. That is, that it's autocratic by its nature. And he said, he came out with a formula. He said, democracy is just another way of organizing oligarchy. Oligarchy is the word of the rule of the few that are at the top of this pyramid, which is really part of our problem. And it also goes to the problem that someone like the great Italian sociologist Vilfredo Pareto in his Mind and Society talked about. He said, look, the real issue, and Weber said this too, is the real issue is not that we have an oligarchy, that we have an elite, because, as Michel said, it was called Michel's iron law of oligarchy. You're going to have this small group of people at the top, no matter how you organize it, is what Michel's pointed out. And what Weber pointed out, and Pareto pointed out, is it's, well, who is that small group? How does a small group come to be in charge of everything? How does that happen? And Pareto had his theory of the circulation of elites. And Weber talked about a process by which certain groups can become on top. And the question is, what qualifies them to be on top? And today, am I wrong, Louise? But the real problem today is the kind of people that are concentrating in the oligarchic structures at the top of our society, not only in government, but in business and in education and in the media. Am I mistaken?
Yeah, you mean the socialists are penetrating all these systems, or the type of people that are occupying this?
A certain type of elite, that is, people who are motivated by a kind of envy and a desire to destroy the existing organic society and to recreate it on their own. These are the people, and they don't have generally traditional aristocratic feelings or thoughts or fatherly patriotic thoughts, which is what the old Roman Senate conscript fathers, they called themselves. They don't have this. The patriarchal element's been removed. The patriotic element's been removed, and it's this pure. Their only allegiance is, well, their only conception is, we are the world. We're everybody. We got to unite the world. And of course, this goes right into socialist collectivism. This naturally becomes their sort of point of departure. That is, the warrior aristocracies that formed Europe, the feudal warrior aristocracies, have been brushed aside, and this was what Joseph Schumpeter was worried about. He said that liberalism only arose, freedom, that is, only arose in the context of a noble warrior aristocracy that in its self-concept of nobility and aristocracy permitted all this freedom because it was noble. This was a noble ideal. Now you have these small-minded, envious bureaucrats whose conception is, we're making, the great one world state, and everybody's going to be as one, like the John Lennon song we talked about on last week's show. We're going to get rid of the superstition of religion and the bigotry of the patriarchy. We're going to have men and women equal, and horse and donkey equal. Everything is going to be equal. So what do you say? It's a catch-22, isn't it? I mean, how do you recirculate the elites to get the mix you want? They're in control.
I think you're touching on a subject that I particularly enjoy, and I think for the viewer, it would be nice, to make a distinction between what you've just mentioned. You made a distinction, but I'm going to reassure it. Where between aristocracy and oligarchy, where aristocracy, the old meaning is the rule of the best.
Yes.
What made them the best was the fact that their intent was the common good. Their intent was for everybody to be better. Whereas an oligarchy is the rule of the few, or the few people have that rule, and their intent is not for the common good. Their intent is for their own good. So there's a little matrix that you can create with these two definitions and their intentions and definitions. But if you see throughout history, the elites, they start out as an aristocracy where they look at the situation and they say, okay, this is we're in a chaotic situation. We need to build from scratch, and everybody's going to sacrifice a little bit for the common good. So the elites are acting as an aristocracy. Now, here, I'm using the term aristocracy just to qualify the type of elite that is present at that time. It's not that they inherited or they have a last name or anything like that. It's just that Korea, for instance, when Korea came out of their quagmire in the 50s and 60s, they were led by an aristocracy. Japan was also led by an aristocracy when they came out of the Second World War. And they were all Israel was led by an aristocracy as well when it was created. So the aristocracy at that point was, they were looking at the common good. What you see here in Brazil, it's none of that. Meaning the elites or the ones that have the power, they are not the aristocrats. They are the oligarchs. They are the ones that are looking at for their own sake, and they're looking at each other as rivals. Whereas the aristocrats would basically help and work together in unison. The oligarchs, they're looking at their own self-interests and basically, trying to get out of this chaos sooner than the other one and try to get as much benefit from the situation as the other one. So we are truly in a oligarchical system where there's no real. We have been devoid of an aristocracy from the term, of the rule of the best that are seeking the common good for a long time. Some people argue that the military in this past system that they occupied sort of a dictatorial regime, that they were aristocrats in the sense that they were looking for the common good, but unfortunately they're tainted in the fact that they did not spur democracy and civil society the way they should have done. So they were just holding on to power, and that's for me that's not a complete way of defining them as aristocrats. So if you look at the past 130 years of Brazil, we're basically being led by interest groups, one after the other, succession. Sometimes we have breakdowns where a populist come over, and then this populist regime takes over, and there's a breakdown. We had 6 constitutions within the last 130 years. So each constitution reflects the oligarchy, a switch of oligarchs. The type of oligarchy that was in place gets displaced by either a populist government or something. It gets replaced by another set of oligarchs, and they change the constitutions and laws because the previous constitution reflect the value system and the control systems imposed by the previous oligarchy. So we're in this continuous excuse me, cycle of one oligarchy after another. Where is the common good over the past 130 years? That has been totally secondary. The reason why Brazil is still considered a rich country is not because of our political system. It's because we are a huge country. We have natural resources. We have a tremendous amount of people that live here, and we have tremendous amount of opportunity. So even a terrible totalitarian socialist system cannot make Brazil a poor country. We'll always be mediocre because of our political system. If we had a liberal system where we had the rule of law and real capitalism, free markets, regulated, to the point of not creating oligarchs and not creating monopolies and so forth, we would easily have a rich country with a high per capita income, a very rich middle class, world travelers, just as if like a mirror image of the United States. I'm pretty sure about this. So
Brazil used to be, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Brazil had a very small state. It had only 13% of its GDP in the first 100 years of its existence. Under the monarchy system and under the First Republic, we still had our constitutions were based on the U.S. Constitution. So we had a very small government. It was only 13% of GDP. In the 1930s, all these communists came over, and socialist ideals started springing up from civil society. and the ruler of the country decided to incorporate them in the constitution, whatever, change the constitution at that point. And therefore there was an insertion of new values in the 1930s, and our cost of the government per GDP, it went from 13% to 15, and then in 10-15 years went to 17, and up in the 70s and 80s it was already on the 27-30%, and currently is over 40%. So all due to new regulations in the constitutions included in it. So it wasn't a cultural phenomenon. It was more of the growth of bureaucracy and the cost of government over the past 130 years, unchecked. And what has been a normal, what has always been there was bureaucracy. Since 1930s, bureaucracy ballooned, and ever since then, it only grew. There was not a single point in 130 years where bureaucracy shrunk and cost less of the GDP. And our GDP, it grew because we're a big country with a lot of opportunities and so forth. Just like China is living now. China is living basically, it's capitalist system. It's not a capitalist system. It's a socialist system that was a little bit of a capitalistic or a liberalization of the use of the means of production and of capital. But that was it. The title holders to most of the Chinese properties are still the Chinese government. It's really like still incredible controls in property and capital. So what they're seeing is basically a growth that is like a repressed demand for goods and services of a middle class society that's happening in China. But it'll stop eventually, and then they'll end up with a system that it's not growing, it's stifled. But I'm making a long story short here. I'm not sure if I am answering your question because you brought up a few points. I'm just rambling with things. But I just wanted to conclude with something that you mentioned, where you were talking about Mises and Weber, how they looked at bureaucracy. It's funny because I saw this anthropologist, and he was talking about Lenin, and there was a piece in Lenin's history where people were trying to understand communism, and they wanted to spread the word of what is communism, and they wanted like a very simple phrase for them to be able to convince people to join communism, or at least for them to understand communism. And Lenin said, communism is, telegraph is a light for everybody, and telegraph. So, that was his definition. In order for their delegates to understand what communism is, it means everybody needs to have light, and they need to have access to a telegraph. And then Weber mentions that bureaucracy is the epitome of civilization, because you need to have a sophisticated system in order to collect taxes, in order to pay salaries of the workers, and also basically you create these technical peoples that operate the laws and the regulations. So in a sense, the definition of Lenin of what communism is, at least at that point, that is electricity and telegraph, alluding to the fact that you need to have some sort of a sophisticated network structure in order to make communism work. The same way you need a sophisticated structure to have bureaucracy work fully. And currently we have a fully digitalized society. In Brazil, our central government has incredible controls of our lives, our assets, our everything, our communications. They can probe at any time that they feel probably the United States is going through the same situation with NSA and so forth. But we're a fully digitalized country, and because our civil society has never risen up against that threat, we're now a communal. We're probably within a communism, a communal framework. So that's a reality already. So I think yeah, I'm sorry. I'm taking too long here, Jeff. I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. I just would like to remember the last interview of Lula, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. He mentioned like this. He just quote Lenin, but not saying light and telegraph. He was saying about the internet and some things about money. He said, we want to make poor people to access this information, these things, and that's what our government did. And he just said that in his last interview. You see how it's amazing. It's incredible how they just say the same thing. But I have a question for you both. Do you think that they want to put more power for this bureaucracy, the socialism? It's necessary for the socialism to make the aristocracy like a bad thing, like talking bad about that, just criticizing them a lot and make their identity less than noble, you know, like a really bad thing. Do you think that socialism did do that all the time, talking against aristocracy to create themselves as the good aristocracy that people need?
You know, I wrote about this in my book, Origins of the Fourth World War. At the beginning of the book, I explain this. If you study Karl Marx, you will find that, and if you study him, not just his writings, but his own personal opinions from his biography, Karl Marx had tremendous admiration for real aristocrats. He, in some sense, envied them. He wanted to be one. He aspired to be dictator of Germany. And I think where Karl Marx, you see, a revolution was happening in previous centuries, which was the revolution of the bourgeoisie, the revolution which the communists talk about, which you had the feudal warrior aristocracy of the medieval times was being challenged by, you know, the cities were growing and the urban bourgeoisie was becoming wealthy. And they were becoming more powerful, and democracy was their political instrument. I mean, many of the aristocrats complained that democracy was their political instrument, and that democracy was really plutocracy. That democracy was a method that the money of the bourgeoisie could be funneled into politics to challenge the aristocratic and feudal structures of the past, and challenge the king, challenge the, you know, you go to the French Revolution and you find this. And there's truth in this, obviously. He's making an observation, Marx was. But Marx, he hated the bourgeoisie. He hated the middle class. He admired the old aristocrats. He saw that they were being challenged, and he saw that they were weak. I mean, if you go to the writing, you look at the 1848 revolution, and you go, my gosh, you know, in Europe, the monarchies are weak. The aristocracy is weak. They could easily be brushed aside by this. This is the thing that Karl Marx saw. And Karl Marx, he made a statement in his writings. He said that history always repeats itself twice. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. Well, what's going on in Marx's mind when he writes this is he's looking at Napoleon I and he's looking at Napoleon III. He's looking at the 1848 and he's looking back at the French Revolution, which was very bloody. But what he's really saying is that that world that was animated by aristocratic values, the old patriarchal aristocratic values, was a more bloody world, was a world of more stoic values, something that appealed to Marx in some sense, who despised the values of the bourgeoisie, and that he wanted to return. He looked at the bourgeoisie and its revolutions as a kind of a farce, you see, and he looked at the more peaceful way of doing things as farcical because he was very bloody-minded. And he wouldn't have minded feudal aristocracy returning on horseback and butchering people and imposing its will, because as long as he was one of the aristocrats, see, because he wanted to be that. He wanted to be the new red aristocrat. And I think that what Karl Marx, his real insight about the bourgeoisie is that it was weak, that the old feudal aristocracy, as much as it had weakened, the thing that was overthrowing it was to him contemptible and weak. And that he thought somebody that was more bloody-minded and ruthless could overthrow them all. And that was part of his vision. And I think that remained Lenin's vision. I mean, Lenin, you know, I mean, that's an interesting quote from Lenin. I've got right in front of me Lenin's, this was published in Moscow, Lenin's writings on Marx and Engels. And one of the things, surprising things that Lenin says in here is he says, well, there is no communist dogma. He just says it outright. He says communism is merely the rational organization of human affairs, which is, you know, the scientific organization of human affairs. And one of the words for communism is scientific socialism, right?
Yeah.
And so they're trying.
We're concluding that modern communism is totalitarian bureaucracy.
Totalitarian bureaucracy, which is conceived by Karl Marx, the founder, as a new aristocracy, as a new way, a ruthless, and see what is contemptible, of course, about the old aristocracy and about the bourgeoisie is that they are humane, that they have liberal values, which Marx had great contempt for, which Lenin had great contempt for, which Stalin had great contempt for, and Mao had great contempt for. So that it's a strong man, it's a Napoleonic. They were really inspired by a vision, an idea of Napoleon Bonaparte, which wasn't even really true of Napoleon Bonaparte. You know, Napoleon had his failings and whatnot, but he wasn't really the same kind of monster that they were. He had his own demons and whatnot, but he wasn't really like them. But they looked at him conquering Europe, coming from nowhere, and he said, that's what we want to be. We want to be conquerors. And of course, Karl Marx looked at his whole philosophy as a kind of trick, to trick the idiots into following us and giving us total power. I think if you read Karl Marx's biography, that comes straight through it. And so, yes, they are trying to take over, and bureaucracy is their instrument of taking over, because anytime you create a structure like this that's pyramidal with the small at the top, they can go straight to the top and take it over from the top. I think, and Luis, what you said about Brazil in the 30s is true about America. We began our relationship with Russia when President Franklin Roosevelt normalized our relationships with the Soviet Union, our diplomatic relations, and then it came flooding in, and our native Communist Party, the Communist Party USA, founded in Chicago in 1919, became this fifth column that worked to infiltrate government. They infiltrated the Agriculture Department first, they got into the State Department and the Treasury Department, and they started concentrating in government. And I believe, you know, there was a concerted effort to take over Brazil in the 30s, as you well know, by the Soviet Union. They thought, oh, Brazil, it's a big country, we can take it over, we can make it into a communist success story. And in the United States, the extent to which communists infiltrated us in the 30s and infiltrated Brazil in the 30s, there's a parallel. In our bureaucracy started growing in the 30s too. Just like in Brazil, we have a parallel. We're both democracies. We both had similar constitutions before that. We were attacked in the same kind of way, in the same style, by the same groups. And so today we face the same problems. Really, we do.
Yeah, I truly think that the parallel is very noticeable, and it's very profound. I put my son in an American school here in Brazil, and I can see the same type of stuff that we're fighting against in the Brazilian school system. I can see that in the American school system, and these are imported Americans. They're not native Brazilians that are just teaching English. These are Americans that live in São Paulo. They were brought in from the United States to educate Brazilians here. So, and they carry with them already this chip, right? That they need to work in that way, and they need to focus on things that are divisive, gender politics and all that kind of stuff. So I think that we are truly in a situation, whether this was planned or not. They definitely planted their seed. In Brazil, they started with the military, with the lieutenants. There was a Revolução Tenentista in the 20s, and so they became part of the army, and part of the army started revolting everywhere in Brazil. So the dictator that took over in the 1930s, he showed up as a fascist dictator, saying, "Look, there's communism right at our door. There's like agents from the lieutenant movement that are part of the military. You know, they might take over the country. So let's I need to take over power. That was one of the reasonings why definitely gave him a lot of credibility to become a fascist dictator in the 30s. Of course, there were other, plutocracy. There was a plutocracy that they wanted to get into the system. It was an oligarchy system with, oligarchical system. It was democratic in many levels, but still, this small group of farmers that control Brazil. And he wanted to break through that. The military wanted to break through into that system. The banks and the industrialists that were, beginning, so they wanted their representative. So they chose this dictator. And one of his arguments was also, the communism that was spreading. But when he took power, he needed to rewrite the Constitution, or he was forced to rewrite the Constitution. And his mistake, even to his own good, he included, the union labor leaders. He included this new socialistic
community.
Yeah, community that were forming underneath this oligarchy. And I'll get into the oligarchy system later, but he needed to include them for some political reasoning. And they created this 1934 Constitution, which is basically a socialist constitution. And he, said right after the Constitution was enacted in 1934, he said, "This is the most ridiculous Constitution that I've ever seen in my life. It's impossible to rule with it. And in fact, it was the shortest Constitution of our history. We never used it. It was 1934, and then in 1937 he enacted his own Constitution. And it was like a dictatorial constitution that validated his power, but it did away with all the union labors and all that, which he created himself. So it was like this back and forth of, unions wanted to take power. But it's funny because in 1946, at the end of the Second World War, everything that was in the 1934 Constitution came back into the 1946 Constitution, and it was okay. It seemed to be okay. Okay, we can work with this. And I'll show you another parallel that happened. In 1964, when we deposed the communist president that was elected, or he wasn't elected, but he was the vice president and he took over, and he was a communist, so he decided to nationalize property all across the urban property, even parts of the agricultural property. And he wanted to nationalize property. So, of course, there was a big movement by the middle class, and everybody, and the military said, okay, we have the legitimacy to take this guy out and just, take the government from him. And that's fine. So the military took over, and there was like 20 years of military government. But then in 1988, a new constitution came up, and guess what's included in that constitution? And everybody seems to be okay. It's the violation of property. So exactly what took out the government in 1964, just wait a little bit of time, time will pass, and we'll put that into the Constitution later on. So government only grew, and the communist principles only grew since the 30s. They never diminished. And now they're embedded everywhere, in every single structure of society. Our language is even limited by that. But I'll tell you about the oligarchy, just to end my comment here. Back in the 30s, and they had a tremendous opportunity to make Brazil a fantastic country at that point, in the beginning of the century, but they wasted it because they maintained that power between only a few people. And what happened is that all these movements, all these social movements, all these different political views that were brewing up in other segments of society, they had no access to the political system. So that only created pressure for them to overthrow the system altogether, instead of just refining and including their dialogue at a certain level that would not be disruptive of a very good constitution that we had. The first Republican Constitution was a good constitution, but they decided to do away with it. The Constitution was not the problem. The problem was the power structure of oligarchs that was switching power between people from 2 rich states of Brazil, and only those, and the other, representatives of other states had no chance on that system. So it suffocated the civil society, and it suffocated participation. So that, I think, it's an alert for any rule of law country today that is creating a system where only, I can see it in the U.S. and not as much as, of course, in Brazil, but definitely I see, for instance, the Bush family. We now have a Bush candidate for president once again. It's kind of why. It's also Clinton, because Clinton was a president. Now his wife wants to become president. So that's looking very much like Latin America, to be quite honest. It's a characteristic that I'm afraid of seeing that type of alternation of power between people that have been close to the power, or that are not necessarily the best. They just know about it, and they gravitate. Of course, Hillary Clinton is a great politician, and Jeb Bush seems to be a great politician. He might have a lot of merit, but it's just you see these things recurring, and it's just worrisome. It strikes me as something that we need to, at least from the U.S. point of view, it's not. I don't see it as a healthy thing a priori, but it may not be a big issue. But I think that civil society needs to control the system a little bit more. And I think what Hans Adam says in his book about Liechtenstein, and he put his own monarchy for vote. He's saying, look, I'm the legitimate heir of this enclave between Switzerland and Austria, and we've saved, with our own money, we saved this country many times over the period of history. But he's willing to give all that away if the people decide that, okay, we don't want a monarchy anymore. So he's switching legitimacy from the oligarchy and from the godlike, God-inherited rights and so forth. He's switching that legitimacy to democracy, like true direct democracy. And I think that's what we need. We need to install those values of direct democracy into our people. And I think that's where the infrastructure created by communism, the bureaucratic infrastructure that we have, if used for those purposes, it can be very valuable. It can be very disruptive in creating a liberal regime once again, giving the freedom again to the individual, using it at that way.
Luis, about this direct democracy, do you think that monarchy would be still in Brazil if you would have this direct democracy? This question, indeed, I would like to make this question again. Do you think that all our oligarchy that take the monarchy in Brazil away, or?
No, look, oligarchy in Brazil historically, the ones that took the monarchy away from the Brazil system was the oligarchs. The oligarchy wanted power for themselves. Why was the monarch? The monarch was at odds with the oligarchy because the monarchs, they did not want slavery. Slavery was holding us back as a country, as in our evolution, as a society, as an economic system. Everything was being held back by slavery. So our monarchs took an executive decision and said, look, we're going to do away with the system. And what that created was the threat to the oligarchs that said, look, we have a threat here. This guy can, come in and rule against us at any point. So we need to take over power. And they were very successful because, for whatever reasons, they were very successful. Would direct democracy have something back then? Of course it would. Direct democracy would definitely limit, that transition of power. Any ruling by the monarch, any ruling by the oligarchs, any ruling by the bureaucrats would be limited by direct democracy. People can rise up and say, no, that's not what I want. That's not legitimate. This is not the process. So that's why the direct democracy, it is a threat, to representative democracy. Actually, it's a total, it annihilates representative democracy. So it has to be also limited, because you still want some aspects to be representative. But to be honest, at least in our situation, our hopeless situation right now, Alan, in Brazil, is that if we do nothing, the bureaucracy will still grow, taxes will still grow, and all of our assets that Brazilian individuals still hold will eventually become communal assets, because that's how the bureaucracy never fails. It will take all the assets and livelihood of everybody before it fails. So, and that's what happened in Eastern Europe. You know, it broke down because there was nothing left for it to suck in, and so I think unfortunately we're in the corridor of death. You know? We need to get out of that. We need to close that door and open another door. You know, that door just leads us nowhere.
I would like to tell our audience that we have some problems. I don't know why, but for a month to now, YouTube are not loading the comments, and then we have some trouble to read the commentaries. People cannot comment while they are watching live. So you can give me questions directly in Facebook, or you can ask through not Gmail, but you can send me through Twitter. So if you want to make some comments now live, I would like to ask you to give this comment or in Twitter or directly in my Facebook. If you are liking this talk show right now, just hit the like button here in YouTube, and we can read your question. Jeff, I just would like to I would like you to show your book again, because the time you showed there was too quickly. So if you could show your book again and tell people how can they buy this book. Yeah, just a little bit back.
It's available on Amazon, and I think that Amazon has international outlets. I believe we made it available in other countries. So it's The New Tactics of Global War, and it's mostly concentrating on the development of Russian power and in the context of their long-range strategy to dominate and how that works. So it's that's the book, and it just came out this past week. I've been doing all kinds of radio interviews over it.
Jeff,
yeah.
What do you think about this idea that I just portrayed here, as far as a solution to avoid becoming totally bureaucratic, communal, and communally dominated?
I'm with Aristotle in believing that democracy is the worst form of government, the most dangerous form of government, if it's pure democracy, of course. I conceive democracy only within a system of checks and balances in which the vote of the people is a check on the greed of the plutocrats or autocrats. It's a check on, could be a check on bureaucracy or arbitrary government. The problem that we have, though, this is a temporary expedient, constitutional expedient, to give the people a greater check on what the bureaucracies and elites are doing. We need to change the elite. And there's two things that are very dangerous for democracy even, because they can shift the democracy to their ground, because it's educational bureaucracy and the media bureaucracy, or the media elite. They can put things on TV and the radio that can twist the mind of the people, that can turn the people against traditional ideas, which they've been doing to cause all of these changes. And in the basic education, it is, see, now people in America, it's very common, they learn a set of ideas in school and in getting their college degrees that they have to then unlearn when they get out in the real world. And more, they're not unlearning it when they get out in the real world. And so now, why is it that now our voting blocks are moving more and more to the left? There's an interesting poll, and I'll hit you with this. They did a very interesting guy. He wrote Left Turn, and I think his name is Glenn Grosclose, is his name. He's an American political scientist, very clever American political scientist, and he developed a method for measuring how far to the left people and organizations are. And he used this to measure the media and measure members of Congress. But his most fascinating discovery was he measured the leftness of the U.S. Democrat-dominated Congress in 1979, and then he measured it, or actually 1980, and then he measured it again for the Republican Congress of 1999. Okay, almost 20 years apart. So Democratic Congress in 1980 and a Republican Congress in 1999. As for those Brazilians listening, our Republicans are to the right and our Democrats are to the left. Well, what he discovered is that the Democratic Congress of 1980, Democratic-dominated Congress, was further to the right, way further to the right, than the Republican Congress of 1999, which means that all political parties have been moving to the left, right? And so that means that, how is this happening? It's education and media. What they call the media, the fifth estate, right? The press, the journalists. So any attempt to use direct democracy can backfire because we haven't taken control of the media. We haven't changed the elite. And the great fear that I have is that the only way, this is my fear, that the only way that the elite's going to be changed is a bloody revolution like the French Revolution. And if you have a principle of direct democracy going into a bloody revolution, we know what happened in the French Revolution. It was terrible. There was incredible bloodshed and incredible instability. So it's a quandary. It's a difficult problem.
It's interesting that you're mentioning that way, because I could probably argue that, you know, in the U.S. you still have the rule of law, you still have checks and balances working quite well. You do have probably a centralization that's beginning. That's already it's more centralized now than it was in the past 20, 30, 40 since the Second World War. It's now more centralized. So that's probably the negatives, one of the negatives. But the U.S. still has, you know, the U.S. system relatively intact. We see these things picking up in parallel to how the bureaucracy works and how the states are still relatively independent from the federal government. But I think in that regard, Brazil is more advanced, and to our detriment. Meaning, I'm not saying that advance here is good. Actually, it's the opposite. Advancement is bad. We are super centralized. We have most of our taxes going to the central government. We do not have states that counter any action from the central government. We do not have localized politics at the local city level. That's probably non-existent. It's a bunch of little oligarchies and plutocracies that took over city government. So we are literally facing a situation pre-1989 where our Berlin Wall is about to collapse, as that's what we hope. Mm-hmm. So what would make this a better system after this collapse or during this collapse, considering that we are at the end of a socialistic cycle? It's stressed to the max. You know, the only things that we'll see now going forward, if we don't do anything, is a series of systemic collapses on different areas of the economy and of the political system. That's what's going to happen if we do absolutely nothing right now. So, in order, considering that is the option, maybe we're in a stage where that's our only hope, you know, and we just need a. In Portuguese, we say we jogamos pra galera. We'll need to depend on the risk that the people are not ready to be questioned directly about politics and where they stand, to the right or to the left. But honestly, that's the only thing that I can see right now going forward. Yeah, we can probably assume that there are other options, which is a right-wing leader that would be more libertarian and would be more liberal in his views, economic, decrease the amount of government. Maybe, yeah, that needs to happen. That can only happen with strong leadership. But I don't see that growing up in the next 3 to 5 years. I don't think there's any real leader out there, unless it's we do make one up in record time and say, hey, this is the new leader that will basically do away with all this bureaucracy and regulations and all this quagmire that we're in, and completely change the power structure and transfer power to the cities and to the states and stay with. I think it's too much to ask from a leader at this point. I don't see any existing that would be able to do that in a short period of time. So that's truly that would be one option if one would be present. But I tend not to like the. That's why I like the rule of law. It's because it's not based on one person. It's based on laws, and whereas everything else is based on people, and therefore I tend to not like that option too much. But I agree with your concern that, especially for the U.S., and considering the effect that media has in the U.S., the media does not have that effect in Brazil. On the contrary, I would say that the enlightened people and the people that are aware in Brazil, they're every month, or it's been a constant that the traditional media lost totally its credibility, and the big media that used to control Brazil, at least public opinion and so forth, especially political public opinion, is in total. Well, total is a hard word, but they're definitely they lost their credibility that they once had, for sure. If you look back, 10 years ago, how they would stand. So they were in part the power that would nominate the government here in Brazil. Without their consent, you would not get a new government. So I don't think that they have the power anymore. I think that they're trying to survive in a situation where they lost their credibility and they lost their revenue because the government is not pulling in as much taxes as it was before. So so that's why I think maybe direct democracy here would still be interesting, at least at the local and state level. But again, you have these concentrations of legitimacy, like at the federal level, that can only work with representative democracy. You cannot have direct democracy in some of those instances. So
I think the proper principle of constitution formation is to break up power and have as many checks and balances as you can without compromising the ability of the society to react against threats from abroad. And you mentioned America. I think that the role of direct democracy in America has been largely negative, although many conservatives look to it to save us now. And the reason I say this is very simple. We have one directly elected leader for the United States. One person's elected by all the people, and that's the president. Well, look who our president is. Look who they elected, Barack Hussein Obama. That is incredibly negative, and you want a challenge to the Constitution? His presidency has been a direct challenge to the rule of law and the Constitution. From the point of view of robbing the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and not using the Attorney General's office to prosecute the stealing of billions of dollars from private funds, to all the other illegal and unconstitutional measures of the Obama administration. Yes, the rule of law is breaking down here, and direct democracy is being used by the left to try to justify the breakdown of it. Who knows what the degree of fraud is. I think there's election fraud, and that's another discussion for another show, but it is these are complicated problems, no doubt about it. And perhaps with Brazil, you have to start somewhere, and maybe it's direct democracy, since your people are waking up, is the only way. But to recreate a constitution that I think you can't change the powers that be without causing bloodshed. So what you need is to create a constitution that acknowledges the different powers but places clear checks from one to the other. And that's what I believe in, checks and balances. That is, when people say, what is your political ideology? Checks and balances, no doubt.
Yeah, pretty good.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So our time is gone. Done. Sorry, our time is done, and I really, really would like to thank you, Luis, to join us again. Thank you very much, Jeff. To be honest with you, I would like to keep talking with you for hours and hours here just in this topic. But I just would like to finish, to close our talk show. Philip has made a really nice statement when he say about this tyrannical oligarchy. And I would like you, Philip, just say that again, because I really love it, because this is the most amazing statement that we can describe what is going on in America, what's going on in Brazil, what is going on even in Cuba. When you guys were talking about what happened in the late 30s, I just remember all things I was studying this week about Cuba, seeing the economy in Cuba, how that was going, and that's what's happening in all these socialist countries. They just turned the power from the not power. I mean, they turn it from the aristocracy to oligarchy. Luis Felipe?
Yeah, well, the situation in Brazil right now, it's very visible that we do have a tyrannical regime. That regime is an oligarchy. That has been our tradition since the beginning of our republic, and now that regime is now more bureaucratic than ever. The level of bureaucracy that we have here is commensurate to any communist system that ever existed, and the fact of removing this government from power will still do not mitigate the issue that we still have a large bureaucracy that will operate probably even better without that government in place. It will probably continue on growing with their norms and regulations, and eventually, well, it is the case that it'll stifle any type of entrepreneurial activity, any type of individualistic initiative that you would have for for our economy and for our society. So we need to do away with both the power structure that creates a tyrannical oligarchy, but also we need to mitigate the bureaucracy. How do we do that? I was proposing something in the lines of direct democracy, and I think Jeff has corrected me and has put me on the right track on at least limiting that direct democracy with the rule of law and checks and balances. So for sure, that's one thing that we as Brazilians, we need to consider. And I just hope that the U.S. within this transition period that Brazil will go through, I hope that the U.S. will still serve as a beacon for our society and for our economic system, because we will need successful partners and a good, strong ally in order for us to make that transition. And I hope that the U.S. also pulls through from its issues that it might be having. And I think I know that it's not to the extent that we're going through right now, but the threat is there as well, as Jeff pointed out. So hope is not a plan, but I'm going to end my conversation as let's hope for the best.
Sure.
Yes.
Jeff, Rodrigo Daves, he just wrote, he just sent me a message. I'm with my old glasses, so I can't read it very well. Can you see the question?
Yeah, I did see the question.
So can you read it and answer, please?
Could you make it available to me again so I could read it?
Okay, sure. Here we go.
Rodrigo Davis, 9 mutual friends. Wonder if Jeff Nyquist has any opinions on this. Believe that money stolen from Brazilian people is funding dictatorships in other communist or proto-communist countries in Latin America. I have been told this is the case. when Olavo was on our program 9 weeks ago, Olavo made the statement that there was a letter from the FARC to the Workers' Party saying that they had saved communism in Latin America because of the money that they had, apparently, if I understood Olavo correctly, the money they had taken out of Brazil and given to, you know, Venezuela, Cuba, I would assume Nicaragua, and the FARC. So yeah, I would go to Olavo as the authority on this. He is the one who's up to date, knows the most about these developments. So if I understood Olavo's remarks 9 weeks ago correctly, that is my understanding too from him.
Yeah, and again, Olavo is right. Thank you very much, guys. Now it's time to say goodbye, unfortunately. But again, thank you, Luis Felipe. Thank you, Jeff. And I hope to see you guys next week. As usual, on Friday, not on Saturday. Today was an extraordinary talk show, and we switched the time because we had some problems to solve. So thank you very much for watching us, and I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye.